Good morning, everyone. Warm welcome and warm good morning to all of you from sunny Barbados. And thank you so much for joining me for this most important discussion on something that really affects all of us, even though sometimes it may not be so obvious. I have with me today two wonderfully brilliant and dedicated gentlemen who are working really hard to right the wrongs of the global taxation system, to make it more inclusive and to make it more fair. It is my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce Mr. Alex Cobham, who is an economist and the chief executive of the Tax Justice Network, and Professor Stephen Dean, professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. Good morning and welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning, Marla. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
So let me just get right into the discussion. Alex, please tell us a little about yourself and the work that you do and what motivates that work.
Thanks, Marla. The Tax Justice Network was set up in 2003, really to fight against the cross-border tax abuses, both of multinational companies and individuals, but also for a better type of financial and corporate regulation, so that we don't face the costs of tax injustice, which are people living in societies that don't have effective states, that can't fund public services, that aren't able to challenge the overlapping inequalities that we all face, and so on. The costs of tax injustice are, faced by everyone in every country. But there's also this global element of tax injustice, and I guess that's where I started. So back in 2000, as a very, very junior researcher at Oxford University, I was working on background papers for the UK government, really when they were looking for the first time at some of the issues around tax havens, to use that label, and thinking just a little bit about the UK's own responsibility. And from there, I came to be involved in the Tax Justice Network. So I've worked at international development NGOs and with research centres, and consulted for different organisations from the World Bank to UN arms, as this issue has become more and more, I guess, closer to the centre of the global policy agenda. And we do now have an opportunity, and I hope we'll talk about that later, perhaps over the next few years, to really start to turn around some of the biggest elements of the power imbalances and the injustices that characterise this whole area.
Thank you for that. And yes, we will talk about that later because that's very important to us in small countries. So thanks for that. Professor, tell us about the work that you do and what motivates your work.
So I'm a professor at Brooklyn Law School. I'm a tax lawyer. I've practiced at some of the biggest law firms in the world for about 5 years before I went into teaching. So I understand how all of this tax planning, corporate tax planning works all too well. I'm very familiar with it. But in terms of what motivates my work, you can see it behind me. So I grew up in the Bahamas. This is a painting. This is not, so I'm in Brooklyn right now. There is snow on the ground. I am not anywhere that looks anything remotely like this picture. But understanding what I know about the way the international tax system works, it made me very curious. In fact, it's what made me go to law school. Getting introduced to this from a group of economists that I work for at one of the big four accounting firms, I was really intrigued by what I learned about the way the international tax system worked, and really couldn't quite believe that it worked the way it appeared to work. So that led me to law school. It led me to practice at a big law firm and to teach corporate international tax for years. I ended up running the graduate tax program at NYU for a few years, all of which just helped me to understand the way the system works and to really understand that there's no way to see how the global tax system works that doesn't acknowledge that there are people involved that have biases, that have their own ways of looking at the world that colors and shapes how they see things. So my work in recent years has really focused on trying to address those biases and explain how it can be that a global tax system could incorporate the kinds of biases that we're going to talk about today.
Well, yeah, actually, that's a nice segue right into that. Tell us about this historical context that got us here with these, biases and injustice, and how they're allowed to exist. Because, the way that developing countries are treated by the OECD and the EU, for example, and other global institutions regarding tax is, they do this, they execute this unfairness and biases with impunity. So just tell us the historical context from your perspective.
Sure. Sure, I'd be happy to. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. So when I think about this, what I think about most, I don't know if you've seen. There's a great Eddie Murphy sketch from Saturday Night Live from years ago. White Like Me. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Yeah. All right. So I'll just tell you a little about it. So so it's great. You should watch it. So he puts on white makeup and he goes around a city. I assume it's New York, but maybe not. And just experiences life as a white person and in his imagination. And he ends with a line that's something like, I'm going to get it wrong. And he just realizes that when white people were alone, they just give each other stuff for free. And what's incredible about that story, and why that reminds me of the national tax system, if you know how the national tax system was structured after World War I, when international tax was white, as I think about it, it was incredibly generous to poor countries. Those poor countries were Europe, right? Europe was in a real tough place after World War I, and the response to the United States, sort of the last man standing on the block, was to create an incredibly generous foreign tax credit, a gift of revenue. Michael Gratz has called it, one of the leading international tax scholars. So that's what happened in World War I. Europe just got a tax system that poured money into poor countries. After World War II, we had the same. And it was only when decolonization happened that all of a sudden we lost that generosity. So I think of the book by Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us, that talks about another really compelling story, that when racial integration happened in the United States, what happened in a lot of communities to their pools. So a lot of communities used to have public pools, municipal pools, and very few have them now. They're mostly private. And she tells a story of how that transition happened when the courts required pools to be integrated. A lot of cities said, "Oh no, we'll fill them in with dirt. We will just fill in our pools with dirt, and we will not have them." So when you understand what happened at decolonization, it's a little bit like that. So the OECD was tasked with taking over the global tax system. We went from a world where there were a handful of treaties between primarily wealthy countries to shortly thereafter a system where we had thousands upon thousands of treaties, which Sylvia Dukharan has pointed out does really nothing other than transfer revenues from poor countries to rich countries. So we went from a system that was delivering gifts of revenue to poor countries when they were Europe, to a system that really prevented everybody from collecting tax, rich and poor countries alike. Nobody had a swimming pool by the time we were done. So when you try to understand how we end up in the world today, where we can't tax these global giants, we really sort of scratch our heads. Well, some of us do, some of us don't. And the OECD looks around and says, well, why can't we tax these why can't we tax these companies? And in 2000, they came up with their blacklist. They didn't call it that, everybody else did. And they figured out why we couldn't tax these global giants. And they figured it was Liberia. In all seriousness,
Liberia was the problem.
Oh yeah, yes. It was one of the few dozen black and brown countries primarily. Switzerland not on the list, of course. But they were really about to impose sanctions on Liberia. I'm not making this up. They really wanted to impose sanctions on Liberia when it was in the middle of a civil war. So they decided all these black and brown countries with beaches were the problem. It's ridiculous, but true. And it was only thanks to the intervention of the US Congressional Black Caucus, when they got wind of this, they objected to it, and the US pulled back its support from the OECD effort. But it's only because they did it so badly, the OECD did. They were so obvious in their biases that the effort failed. But this is the world we live in now, where we have a system that is designed so that nobody can have pools. And we point at countries like Liberia as the reason for that, which is absurd, clearly. But because of the way the world works, we're all too willing to believe that.
Absolutely. Alex, I see you're anxious to jump in there because I know you want to talk about the colonial history as well to all of this.
Oh, more than that, I want to read Stephen's book when it comes out. That's what I'm waiting for.
Me too. You can join the line right behind me. I'll give you a spot right behind me.
That's great. No, I'm just kind of thinking about the going back even a bit further to the stages of formal empire and the period of violent extraction and dispossession, but of resources and of people, where tax was often used as part of the imperial extraction mechanism, whether that was done, say, through the East India Company or other mechanisms with local administrators, the extraction of revenue from local people, not to provide them with public services or even administration, but simply to send the money back to the metropolis, is kind of, if you like, the first imperial age of illicit financial flows. And the second one is what gives rise to kind of where we are now. So the second one is sort of the end of empire, or the end of formal empire, where with countries increasingly becoming independent, people who've held their assets, their illicit assets that they've been able to take in colonies because of the power of empire, are worried that with independence they may be expropriated, as frankly they should have been. But they're also worried if they take the money back to the metropolis, imperial powers in that period, First World War, right, exactly, are starting to really raise income taxes for the first time to fund their own wars with each other. So people look for a place in the middle, and this is what Vanessa Ogle calls funk money. It's money that's running afraid of both ends. So they want to stay within the protection of empire, but they don't want to be back in the metropolis. And at that stage, you get people setting up the opportunities, typically in smaller colonial territories, to allow that sort of ownership to be offshored, but keeping it within typically the English law system. And that gives rise, particularly as the UK forces or encourages and supports more jurisdictions down that road in the 50s and 60s, to the period we're in now, the kind of the third age of illicit flows, where cross-border tax abuse is really just a part of the world around us. So Dukharan, who's a lecturer in London, has written that this is part of Aimé Césaire's boomerang effect. The imperial powers allowed tax abuse in the colonies, not realizing that it was going to come back and hit them too. And now we're in this position that Stephen talked about, where we're all losing, every country is losing to these tax abuses, and we don't have rules to discipline them. But where we do, they're very much filtered through this colonial lens that has a clear racial element, and only certain jurisdictions can be targeted, with the effect both that we do a great deal of damage to those jurisdictions, but also it's completely ineffective. It doesn't stop the tax abuse because we're not able to say, look, the United States is top of the financial secrecy index, we should do something about them. We can only go after smaller, weaker territories. So the global scale of the problem is continuing to grow, and here we are.
And here we are. But we have to change that where we are, right? Professor Dean, so you're writing a book, which I'm first in line, Alex is second in line to get. In your work going into this book, and in your work more generally, what are you seeing around how this is going to change? What might prompt it to change? The ways in which it's changing, what it's going to look like when it changes, because it can't continue. We cannot continue. Like Oxfam recently reported at the World Economic Forum, as they do every year, their global inequality report. And what that is basically telling us is that we have state capture. We have policymakers that are captured by the super rich. And so this system that you're talking about that has deep and long-standing historical underpinnings, that is being perpetuated. These biases and this unfairness is being perpetuated by the policymakers because they are captured by the powers that be to continue with this agenda. I want to hear from both of you, but let's go to Professor Dean first. What are you saying as regards to how is this going to change and what it's going to look like?
Well, it's interesting. Just about a week ago, I just a few blocks away from here, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, I heard Cornel West interview Bernie Sanders about Bernie Sanders' new book, It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism. And it was really interesting because when you hear these two fellows talk about the way the world looks now, what they expected of the world and what the world has actually delivered to them, it's possible to be somewhat optimistic about what the next generation will do. I've got a 14-year-old. I'm not sure what kind of world we're going to deliver to him, but I do think that there is a real possibility that if the work you're doing, Marla, and the work Alex is doing, and the work I'm trying to do, and many others, if we're able to explain why the system is so badly broken and why the tools we're using to try to fix it are certainly not helping, as Alex has said, and sometimes making the situation worse, if we can have a real clear-eyed look at the system and decide whether who should be in charge, what kinds of change we want to make, what our priorities should be. So we've just had the last few years have been pretty exciting for tax nerds. We've had these two pillars which have been crafted that we've told are going to save us, but we're not quite sure what they're for. I think the first step is to have a conversation about what it is that the international tax system is trying to do. And it can't just anymore be trying to protect big multinationals from tax. That's no longer, I think, a valid reason. And if we really think about that as the foundation of our global tax system, it's a little scary. And we have to understand what our values are. We have to understand what it is that we care about. It can't just be sort of hand waving about countries like Liberia, threatening countries like the United States. That doesn't work anymore. But we're still doing something all too similar to that. But we have to understand what it is that we want. Right? We have to have a conversation about what our goals can be. Whether that happens at the UN. I personally like to imagine ATAF in charge of everything. That's my dream. But
Can
the
you
African
tell us
Tax
who that
Administrators
is?
Forum. Yeah, so that's the African Tax Administrators Forum. And I think the OECD has had its turn. I think we can safely hand the mic off to ATAF and see what they come up with. That would be great. So I don't think it's going to happen, but a boy can dream.
A boy can dream, and a girl too. But it's so funny what you're saying, and it's so true. And I know that Alex is going to talk about this, but obviously what they're doing is not working. The fact that every year Oxfam tells us inequality has gotten worse, and
oh no, it is working. It depends what your goal is. It's working great.
That's true. Okay, you're right. It's doing what
if your goal is to protect multinationals from tax. Okay. It's perfect. It's amazing. You have a little drama to distract everybody from the fact that nobody's paying any tax anywhere. You come up with. So I've been at Brooklyn Law School a long time, and now it's one French bakery now replaces another. It's just that's where we are. But when I first started, there would be guys playing 3-card Monte outside the law school. Do you know this game? So it's a little trick that you use to play to scam people. But you have 3 cards and you spin them around on a table, and you have somebody guess which card is going to be their card. And if they guess right, they get money. But they never guess right because you've been doing this your whole life and you're really good at it. And that's what the OECD has been doing. I mean, they're playing a really complicated game of 3-card Monte, and everybody's just sitting around dazzled by what they're doing. But there's nothing to it. It just doesn't. There's nothing there. So I think it is working very well. But right. You have to understand what the game is that's being played.
Absolutely, you're right. It is working, and it's suiting their intentions and their purposes perfectly. Alex, tell us, how are you going to save us?
Oh man, You know, like I want to dwell a bit more on what's wrong with where we are before kind of
Yes,
saying something a bit more optimistic about where we might
sure.
go. You know, partly, you know, to talk about the idea of blacklisting, because I think it's, apart from being an important element of the tax world that we're in, it also tells a story. And, you know, this is a story that Stephen in his book with Etienne Warris has, in his paper with Etienne Warris, and I hope in the book we'll tell it at greater length. But just to pick out some pieces, you know, the idea of creating lists of, well, what the EU call non-cooperative jurisdictions, jurisdictions who don't cooperate with us, right? And that in itself is telling, because that list, which was started in 2017, by definition excludes European Union member states. They
Absolutely.
are not in the category that could be considered as cooperative or otherwise, because they are us. And, you know, and then you have the United States, which in this case it's more tricky, but by design they effectively hang the assessment for one piece on the OECD, knowing that the OECD cannot say that its biggest member is non-compliant, and therefore the EU list, by implication, will be unable to say that the US is non-cooperative, so it's all okay. Nobody powerful can be offended by this. But you know, this is a list which, on the published criteria, before they started, they did set out the criteria, which was a step forward for some form of transparency. We reckon that 6 different European Union member states would have been on that list had they applied it to themselves, for which reason, of course, they never have done and probably never will do. The OECD listing process and the IMF list from back in the day are a similar thing. The politics underlying how the final judgment is made overrides everything else. And perhaps the most important list today at the minute is the FATF list on anti-money laundering. Based on, you know, FATF was set up by the G7 in 1989, but it now has a fairly broad membership, broader than lots of other bits of the OECD. And 40 recommendations, which you would think the mutual evaluation process would be able to deal with in a straightforward way. Mainly that gives you 11 what they call immediate outcomes, and each of them for each country or jurisdiction is assessed as low, moderate, substantial, or high. And then there's a plenary discussion to make sure everything's okay, and then a final report is published. So this should be, you know, the model of transparency and accountable listing, if there is such a thing possible. But of course it's not. You know, and the paradigmatic example of this is of course my country, the United Kingdom, which in 2018 was assessed, and this has been very carefully constructed back by various researchers. What actually happened was the most extreme case of manipulation of the rules. So of those 11 areas, the UK managed to get itself upgraded in the plenary discussion, not through showing that there were new facts, but simply through its political power, from substantial to high, therefore making sure that it was in fact seen as one of the very best. After the plenary and before the report was published, it also managed to get a whole set of criticisms removed or watered down. So the report ended up as a glowing tribute to the UK when, you know, we all know that the UK has a really serious money laundering problem, and one that it imposes on lots of other countries too. So we're kind of in this position where we know that listing doesn't work. It doesn't create the right effect on those countries that are listed, and the wrong countries escape listing. You know, the IMF estimates that if you get listed by FATF, it costs you on average 7.6% of your GDP in terms of lost investment flows. Now that's kind of extraordinary for a process that is not just broadly unaccountable, but also clearly being manipulated. And of course, the countries that suffer that are the ones that don't have the political power to manipulate it. So, okay, let's be more positive. Where do we go if this is how wrong the world is? And, you know, and the OECD pillars, you know, to back that up too, you know, are another example of this. What was once quite an ambitious idea has collapsed entirely. Pillar 1 is really only affecting a small bit of profit, so it isn't dealing with profit shifting at all. And Pillar 2 has simply created a different sort of race to the bottom between conduits and headquarters countries, while everybody else continues to suffer all of the losses from profit shifting. We can't think that we're going to find an answer under the current power structures. And anyone really, I think the evidence is now so clear, so overwhelming. Anyone who's still defending that idea, telling us that, well, the OECD has the technical capacity and so we should really do it there. Anyone who's still making that argument today is, at best naive, and I think at worst deeply disingenuous, and really seeking to perpetuate a status quo that we know deepens the injustices rather than ameliorating them. And so finally, I am going to be positive. Last year we saw this great breakthrough at the United Nations, a resolution passed not just by the G77 countries that have pushed it for decades now, but actually passed unanimously, so with the support of all OECD members, even if some of them afterwards spoke rather critically of it. And that resolution has kind of fired the starting pistol on a set of intergovernmental discussions and a report that the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is now preparing on the options, looking ahead to formal negotiations on a UN tax body that could finally create standards that are inclusive for everyone, so everyone can benefit rather than just OECD members and some others from new modes of transparency, but also that everyone can participate in setting the rules. Now, there is a long way to go, and we know the OECD itself has been leading opposition, but the prize is now there in front of us over the next perhaps 2-3 years for countries all around the world to engage and try to claim back the tax sovereignty, the right to be an effective state and to deliver for their people, which this system and bits of this system have stripped away since the end of formal empire without leading to any great changes. This is the moment to undo that, to decolonize, if you like, the tax system. And if we miss this chance, I don't know when it will come again. So I guess it's a call to everyone to say, what are your policymakers doing? Are they engaged? What are they asking for? How much effort are they putting into this? Because this is a window that won't stay open for that long.
Do you think this window will close with any change in leadership at the UN? And my second question, how long do you think this is going to take? Where the UN can actually construct this body, this inclusive body that will then supersede the OECD in terms of its tax governance?
Yeah, I mean, there is a risk that, we end up in another bigger game of three-card Monty, that this becomes another place that the effort goes and policymakers tell their people, no, just, wait, we're dealing with it over here. It's really happening. And then nothing. So I think we must be impatient, we must demand the impossible today. The window really is quite short. In September, the Secretary General's report will be delivered and there's a scheduled debate at the General Assembly. Following that, October, November, the second committee will debate another resolution, and that would be the one that starts formal negotiations. Now, what should happen is that includes a timetable and the resources necessary to back those negotiations with a view to delivering by the Financing for Development Conference in 2025. So that gives you a kind of a clear window that should be locked into that resolution and agreed this year, so that everyone knows where this is going. That's not the end. That's kind of then the start of the big fight. But at that stage, it is entirely possible. And I think the G77 have learned from what happened last year that when they actually say, do you know what, we're just going to go ahead with this because we've got the numbers. And, yes, we haven't pushed this before because you keep telling us that you'll block it and be unhappy. But actually, when we go ahead, you don't want to oppose this, or not publicly. And so, in fact, you come into the unanimous consensus. I think we can see that dynamic again. But we need some of the OECD countries to be better than that, to be actually supportive. I think partly they let it go last year because there's quite a lot of frustration from OECD members about how badly the OECD has failed in the last 10 years. And so
or succeeded.
Well, or succeeded. But among the countries that are, not my country perhaps, but some others that are genuinely concerned about fixing this, at least for themselves. But I think some even have a global concern. It's bringing them into this process and saying, there is a way for us all to be empowered to do better progressive taxation, to deal with our inequalities, to have more effective states, better public services, and we should all benefit when that works. And in fact, to be effective, we pretty much need everyone inside the ring. But it's a long road, and there's a lot of work to do for all of us.
And that's an interesting thing about global progressive taxation regimes. I mean, I don't know, Professor, if you remember when you were in the Bahamas, what it looks like, but most of us in this region, and I mean, I'm talking now about domestic tax systems, we have regressive taxation systems in place. So we have a value-added tax that's 15, 17 or more percent. And in some countries, no income tax, no corporate tax, or like here in Barbados, corporate tax that's 5.5% maximum, whereas personal income tax is, somewhere around 29% maximum. Now it was higher. And so it means that people at the lower income levels are spending a larger proportion of their incomes on taxes compared to those at the higher income levels. And that's something that we even have a domestic challenge that we need to fix. But I really look forward, and I hope that the global taxation pressures also, because sometimes we get pressured to comply with certain requirements that perhaps are not in our favor to comply with. Okay, so let's see, we're just about the bottom of the hour now. Maybe we can turn to take some questions from the audience, unless either of you wanted to add anything else.
I mean, I have questions for you and Alex, but let's see if the audience has questions.
I've gotten a few questions from the audience, and yes, just as a reminder, the audience, you can submit your questions through the questions panel on your screen. So to start off, base erosion and profit shifting is an important matter to address internationally, but I've often found that it's so much easier for international entities to punish developing nations instead of having conversations with the actors or entities in developing nations who are shifting the wealth. So can you please comment on this? Like, how could this be designed differently?
Either of you.
I can start. So, there's so many good ideas out there, and so many of them that are just not talked about. So one of my former colleagues, Rebecca Kaiser, before she went into the Treasury Department, I think worked closely with Treasury Secretary Yellen, wrote an article about, I think it's called Unraveling the Tax Treaty. And in it, she said, these tax treaties have been criticized for a while for their effects on, as I mentioned, Sudan, criticized them for their impacts on developing countries, but they're really terrible for rich countries too. They're really a bad deal for everybody. And one of my favorite crazy ideas is, how about we just stop doing that? What are they for? Why exactly why do we have all these treaties? I'm really not quite sure. So I use that example of a really crazy idea that maybe isn't so crazy. What if we just stopped doing all the things we've been doing that have either been working or not working, depending on your perspective, for the last few decades? The answers may be quite simple. Obviously, we know, maybe less glibly, there have been real proposals that have been made in quite serious ways by very serious people for many years, formula apportionment being one of them, right? That there are ways we could actually impose and collect taxes from multinational corporations. We've known how to do it as long as I've been in this game, and there's just been no appetite for it at all. It's really not that hard. As we've been talking about, it's really just a political matter. If what you want to do is just work around the edges and say, the system we have is fundamentally sound. We just need to add a few tweaks, maybe 14 action items, but everything is really fine. You could do that, or you could say, well, we just need 2 pillars to prop up a system that is fundamentally fine, but we just need these 2 pillars. But what if we could do something very different, and that might actually work? I just don't. I think the kinds of opportunities Alex is talking about are not. They may seem hard to somebody who isn't, who isn't a tax lawyer, who understands, how all this works. But you could do things a very different way. I'm not sure it would work perfectly, but what we're doing certainly is working. So, I'd love to hear what you think about this, Marla, what you think, Alex. But I know that there are other ways to do this that people who are smarter than me have thought about and worked out in detail. And I'm just not sure why we're not talking about those options.
Alex, you go ahead.
But with the proviso that I also want to hear your thoughts, Marla. But I mean, I agree entirely. In the 1920s and 30s, the League of Nations, the imperial powers, took a decision between two choices for corporate tax. One was the arm's length principle, where they'd say for a multinational, and that's probably a multinational operating in the imperial metropolis and in one colony, say, the prices on the transactions between subsidiaries at either end had to be at the market price, as if they were acting at arm's length, the subsidiaries, rather than part of the same multinational group. And then the profits would be in the right places and we'll tax them, the end. Now, with a very simple multinational, and when the colony and the imperial power are basically under the same government, that's probably not a totally unreasonable decision. What they rejected in doing that was unitary taxation with formula apportionment. So taxing the multinational at the unit of the whole group, because that's where it maximizes profits, and then saying, we will apportion that according to where the real activity takes place. So forget what you can do with your transfer prices to put the profits here or there. If 10% of your sales and 10% of your employment are in this jurisdiction, then 10% of your profits will be taxed there, the end. And that way, you pretty much take out most of the incentives for profit shifting, because you make it almost impossible. There's still a bit of incentive to, competition for real activity that can happen. But again, within bounds, there isn't this kind of very aggressive race to the bottom. We haven't done that. In 2013, the G20 countries said to the OECD, we have one goal, which is to reduce the misalignment between where multinationals' real activity takes place and where they declare their profits. Now, everyone outside the OECD said, oh, well, that's great. That means they want unitary taxation with formulary apportionment, because that's what gives you that answer. And the OECD said, oh, well, we can't get rid of the arm's length principle. That's terribly important. And, you introduce all sorts of scary uncertainty. Let's keep things how they are. And we'll do these 14, 15 action points, and that will fix it. 2019, they say, right, we've got it now. We have to go beyond the arm's length principle, right? And that was a big step. It was a big shift. But then Pillar 1, which could have been, and the G24 group of developing countries proposed this, that could have been an entire shift to unitary taxation, ended up being beyond arm's length pricing for only a tiny bit of the profits of a handful of the biggest multinationals. Everything else, even if that's ever agreed, which it may never be anyway, but even if it is, all other profits will remain under the arm's length principle, which we all know doesn't work. And so we're kind of trapped in this wheel going, oh, this is difficult, isn't it? What should we do? But we know what to do. We just choose again and again not to do it. And the question is whether, in a UN setting where the negotiation isn't hidden behind closed doors and nobody really knows what their own government has said, when it's actually in the open, and governments are accountable to their people as well as to each other, maybe we get there. Because who wants to oppose the one thing that would actually work in public? I mean, who?
Well, and that's the thing, you have to make it public and you have to shame them, which is, I guess, essentially why they supported this resolution at the UN in the first place, because they were ashamed to be seen to not support it.
Yeah, exactly. It's the first time the G77 have taken this to the stage where it requires a public vote. and suddenly all the opposition said, oh, we'll join the consensus. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. And we've seen, the US behave better in climate negotiations when they're in public, for example, because of the pressure from others. It's that kind of dynamic, because, tax, at the end of the day, it's not technical, it's political. And we can't leave it in the technical box over there for other people to sort out and tell us the answer. We have to all see it and take part, and that's when we'll get progress.
Yep. I mean, my own take is, when you look at the methodology of the OECD, when you look at the methodology of the EU for their blacklisting, even last night I was looking at the FATFs, which is a whole other issue around money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. To me, it must be that these methodologies are deliberately complex, first of all, because as we say in Trinidad, it's a make work program. They have to make work for all of these public servants, right, in these large institutions, because I really don't see the merit and the value that it adds in being so complex. And this assessment, then you add this assessment, then you go to this committee and then that committee, and it's like all these layers. So you do an on-site audit in 2019 and the report doesn't come out till 2022 because it's so complex. So that's the first thing. Keep it simple, silly, right? Because principle. But also, I think that we need to understand as well that depending on the development stage that a country is at, the taxation system will differ. And the optimal taxation system will differ depending on the development stage you're at. And let's be fair that the taxation system that might work in the United States is not the taxation system that will work in Dominica, right? And not the taxation system that will work in Guyana, which is the newest oil exporter in the world. So it has to be right size and has to make sense domestically, and it has to be progressive. And these are all things that we have within our power domestically to fix right now, and we haven't yet. But that's really my kind of high level take on all of this.
Marla, I've gotten a lot of questions, and they're basically on 3 topics. So I'm just going to go ahead and name those 3 topics, and then we can let the gentleman go ahead and respond. Are there any merits that are working in the current system? Is there anything that we should conserve? Is there anything that we're doing right that we need to keep in place? Second question is, what will change under the global minimum tax? How will it eliminate the issue of blacklisting? And then the third question is, what do our nations actually need to do? Is it the individual countries that need to make some sort of appeal? Is this a matter of international law? Who needs to be pushing this effort? How are we going to actually get this changed?
Okay, take it away, guys.
Those are hard questions.
Sorry. Do you want to take a stab, Alex?
I was going to enjoy you dealing with the difficult stuff first.
Well, so I think on the question of what can be preserved, I think there's a lot to love about the system. I mean, I love international tax. I think it's super fascinating. I think the questions that we're asking are the most important questions out there. How we share, how we build community, how we pay for the important public services that we need. That's really exciting. And I think that, listen, I'm as tough as anybody is on the OECD, but there are a lot of very smart, hardworking, intelligent people there that have their hearts in the right place. And I think that, we have the brain. We just maybe need the heart. And I think that you don't need to, I don't think the OECD needs to be disbanded or its tax arm needs to be dissolved. I think it just needs different leadership. I think it needs to have guidance from a different kind of organization. I think that they are, it's a little bit like having this really powerful military, and you may not all want that, but you can't just have that. You need leadership that's going to make sure that it is doing the work that is really important. So I think that we need to keep a lot of what we have. We have a lot of technical expertise, and I think we don't need any more. We have enough, but it is important. This is going to be hard, even if we do the kinds of things Alex is talking about. We're going to need that. So I do think that is something that is valuable that we should keep. And is there anything else you think we should keep, Alex?
I really liked your point earlier of suggesting that we move from having the OECD dominate everything to having ATAF. I think that's the right role for the OECD. They are effectively a regional tax body, and there are other regional tax bodies, and you'd like to see all of them, empowered to feed into a global process. Not perhaps any one of them dominating, and certainly not the OECD still, but seeing their role within that global process, supporting their own members. So that feels valuable, and we have seen the other regional bodies become more effective over time. The one thing, in a sense, that hasn't really happened is that the UN Tax Committee, although it's proven itself very effective, especially in the last few years, at bringing forward measures, that continues to be seriously underfunded compared to the OECD, and it's a tiny fraction of the budget. So I think we do need to see not a destruction of the OECD, but certainly a shift of some of the excess resources into the UN system. In terms of the global minimum tax question, look, I don't think that's changing very much, because it's the level is relatively low, but also the way it's been gained, even before the construction is final, will allow lots of playing off between conduit jurisdictions and headquarters countries, and the underlying level of profit shifting probably won't change. I think on that, perhaps it's worth saying, and I should have done before, we estimate that the global losses, revenue losses to cross-border tax abuse are, I think the last year was $483 billion a year, call it $500 billion. The amount of illicit flows of profit and hidden assets and income streams under that is in the many trillions. So it's an order that's kind of material in terms of the global economic accounts. This isn't a marginal thing. Back in the early 1990s, US multinationals were shifting about 5% of their global profits out from the places where they arose. By the early 2010s, that had become 25%, and it's been rising 35. So this has become a dominant feature of our globalization. And exactly as Stephen says, this is why we need to deal with this. It's a big issue of our times. Marla, I think the point you make really is the one that is kind of why that matters so much. It's absolutely true that there's no one optimal tax system everywhere, and a lot of what the IMF and the World Bank did between the 70s and the 2000s was trying to impose one in a way that was very, very damaging. But at the same time, there are problems of tax that are pretty much common across the board. So almost everywhere, though it's a matter of degree, we have regressive taxes that are far too important in the grand scheme of things, and progressive taxes that are far too small. And one consistent effect of that is that households at the bottom end of the income distribution, which are overwhelmingly and disproportionately headed by women, including people living with disabilities, racialized and other minorities, are paying a higher proportion of their income in tax than the people at the top end, who are disproportionately not any of those things. And so our tax systems are exacerbating the inequalities in our societies rather than fixing them, or even standing still. They're actively making them worse. And that's kind of driven by these problems at the international level. Until we can rise taxes on profits, on assets, on wealth, on personal incomes, and capture the offshoring of them effectively, we are all going to live in societies that are more unequal, and particularly in terms of these overlapping inequalities, than they need to be or than we want them to be. So this is worth fixing.
And just one thing I would add in terms of what I think the last question was, what we need to do, what we can do. We're just in the United States. Sorry, I hear some sirens happening in the background here, but that's just New York. What were the conversations we're just starting to have here in the U.S. At a high level? There was a study put out by Stanford organization just a few weeks ago that showed that U.S. taxpayers who are Black are 3 to 5 times more likely to be audited by the IRS than white taxpayers. Yes, they just discovered this. I like to use the hashtag filing while Black, that it is hazardous. And I use an example. I talked about the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus intervening international tax and having a huge positive impact. It wasn't able to end the reign of the blacklist, but it ended the first blacklist and the threat of sanctions just by being involved and asking questions. And we're too willing, as Alex said, to treat all of this as a purely technical exercise. It's not. It's really not. And if
it affects our everyday lives, all of us.
And it's something that we all, were. And I can say this because, I'm a tax professor, right? It's easy to understand the key issues. Some of the things, none of us really understand, and I think that's by design. But the most important questions are ones that we can all really understand. And I think that we need to not be cowed. We need to not be afraid to ask questions. And it's not enough for those in charge to say, don't worry, your pretty little head. We'll sort this out. It's really complicated. Let us deal with it. Yeah, it's complicated, but it's also really important. And we all need to have a voice. We need to ask our leaders what they're doing, just as the Congressional Black Caucus asked its leaders what the hell they were doing, supporting this incredibly biased campaign. And George Bush, who was Republican, said, "Yeah, what are we doing? Why, how are we going to impose sanctions on Liberia and one of our own jurisdictions in this crazy way?" So I think it's important to not think that we're not smart enough to ask these questions. You are smart enough, and you should ask questions, hard questions, and demand clear answers, not gobbledygook.
That's exactly right. And I can hear my team in the background saying, why didn't I say that? That's it. We have an opportunity now to demand all of our governments. What's your position on this? What are you looking for in these UN discussions? Who are you working with in your region? There's a very strong position from the Africa group because the finance ministers kind of kicked off this process last year by passing a declaration at the Economic Commission for Africa, stating their position and calling for the start of negotiations. In Latin America and the Caribbean, under UN ECLAC, there will be a summit that Colombia is leading with pre-meetings beginning in May, so May, June, July, to bring together countries from across the region to come up with, if not a common position, at least a shared discussion about what their positions can be. It's not so clear what's happening in the rest of the world outside the OECD, where we know there are some moves to kind of to get a blocking group together. So we need everyone, civil society in every country around the world, asking their governments what their position is and why if they're not taking a positive position, why not? Put your policymaker under some pressure at least to give an explanation of what they're doing here and why they're doing it. Because, again, this is a window that we may not have again for a long time, and we must take this chance now.
And if we don't speak, it's not that they're not hearing from anybody. They are definitely hearing. When so I'm doing some research on Stanley Surrey, so one of the giants of U.S. international taxation. And there's a great story in the early days of the Kennedy administration. I was looking at his papers that are now at the Harvard Rare Book Library, and you can see what they were doing. There was this, almost spy thriller level intrigue where they were worried that the Swiss Attorney General was going to put people in jail if they did too much work in investigating the Swiss subsidiaries. This was all going on behind the scenes, and they never talked about it. They just never, the story has never been told. I'm going to tell it, but they've never told the story of this. And in those same files, I found a story by a leading U.S. newspaper that was trying to talk about what the threat of tax havens look like, and it starts with a reference to Native women sitting around under gaily colored parasols. So it's just, this incredible. This is from the start, right? This is always how it's been. That we're not willing to call out the countries that are the real problem, and instead we use, I'm delighted to live in a world where you can't do that now. You can't start an article talking about Native women sitting under gaily painted parasols, but we're doing the same thing, just using coded dog whistle language. And it's really time to not do that anymore. It's time to ask your leadership, why we can't have public pools, right? Why we can't have nice things. And they need to give you real answers. They can't just say it's complicated.
Absolutely.
They can't just say, it's Liberia doing it to us, because that's ridiculous. It's time for you to ask for real, serious answers.
All right. Well, Marla, we've come to the end of the time allotted for today. So I've gotten a lot of questions. And so I want to let the audience know that I will be sending those questions that have come in to the panelists and to Marla. And, that enables us to really make sure that the focus of our efforts going forward are on understanding these issues that matter to you. So we will, of course, Marla's research is all published at marladukharan.com/blacklist on this topic. And with that, I'm going to go ahead, Marla, and let you wrap it up. And thank you to the whole audience for joining us, and to the gentlemen as well on the panel.
And both of them have books coming out. I don't know how they managed to make the time to talk to me today, but I am eternally grateful. And I am
we're fans. We're fans, Marla.
I am first in line for each of your books. I really am grateful, guys. You have left me and hopefully left the audience with a lot of hope that change will come, and that we have to lift our voices collectively to our policymakers and ensure that they get this right, because the window is small, as you put it, Alex, and we all want to have pools, right, Professor Dean? And the time is now. We have an opportunity to make change, and I really am so grateful to you for coming out today and firing us up for that. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day ahead.
You too. Thanks, Marla. And thanks, Stephen.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.